What is yonder? Let me take you to the Lincoln Farm in southern Indiana, less than 50 miles east of New Harmony, 17 miles north of the Ohio River. This is where Lincoln first encountered yonder. It was eventually a 100-acre farm that his father, Thomas, staked out in the winter of 1816, then brought his family. When you go there, you will see that, like New Harmony, it is a thin place, a spiritual place. For all his thick-headed yeoman dullness and mediocrity and even cruelty, Thomas Lincoln picked a parcel of land that has contour, what I would call shape. Something else is there, held. The land was very thickly forested, with trees larger than any that have been there since, when the Lincolns first arrived. So maybe it didn't even look like it does now. Maybe Tom Lincoln never saw what he had picked out until after he and his son and his cousins and their friends had cleared it in a virtual war against the trees. When you get there, if you're honest, yonder is what you would want to seek too. For all the beauty that is held there, for a young mind and heart like Lincoln's, it would eventually be a confining place. Indeed, Lincoln, whom Kaplan suggests thought of himself in his youth in some intuitive way as a great man, potentially maybe even as great as Shakespeare were he to write. This little 100-acre farm was a place he would want to leave. But yonder was in that place. And yonder was in the language that Lincoln loved. When he returned to his childhood home in 1844 to give some political speeches for Henry Clay, he became overcome with nostalgia. He had said that southern Indiana was one of the most unpoetical places in the world. Yet he was moved at that time to write one of his most profound poems, called My Childhood Home, about his memories of youth and the misery of his friend Matthew, who had a mental illness. Lincoln's language was poetical wherever he went. Restorationists believe that they have found the outline foundation of one, if not the, Lincoln cabin. Since there would have been several outbuildings, they are reluctant to say that this is the very spot, the very cabin that he lived in, but certainly it is of the size and is close to the location. It is surrounded now by a low brick wall, and there is a bronze casting of the foundational outline and the stone fireplace. There is grass growing, short and green, in the rectangle that is about 14 by 17 feet. It is shockingly small, and more so for the 8-member family that lived there. On that negligible patch of land lived this man who shaped the largest event in our history and shaped it with his words. Only yonder could have gotten him from that little plot to the power to hold the country together and to find the words to enable the Union to reunite. Yonder is where the horizon of the earth meets the boundary of heaven. Yonder is where the romantic heart goes when it yearns for more life. Yonder is what motivates a pilgrim's progress. Yonder is what called Lincoln's relative Daniel Boone into Kentucky and drove the poetic holy man Johnny Appleseed west and captured the artistic imagination of his neighbor John James Audubon and inspired the Germans and Scots who looked for utopia in New Harmony. Yonder is one of the two things that made Lincoln angry as a boy. Lincoln would be fiercely angry, silently angry, if he heard someone say something that he did not understand. If something was out there, a mystery, beyond the reach of his mind, he was restless and ruthless until he could reckon it, figure it out. If knowledge was beyond him, he fought fiercely to bring it in close. The other cause of anger in Lincoln as a youth was injustice to others. Lincoln yearned and longed for the right to replace the might of those who would abuse it. It made him angry when the moral arc of the universe seemed beyond reach. Yonder was what fed his soul. Poetry was the language of yonder. Lincoln would read and write poetry all his life. From youth to the end of his life, he was never far from his volume of Burns, the romantic rebel of Scotland. From Lord Byron, the radical romantic of England. Or Shakespeare, the greatest poet anyone knew in the world that Lincoln grew up in. Yonder was what he saw when he saw the falls at Niagara. And he wrote a philosophical and poetic piece about that. He pictured the falls as existing all the way back through time. The time of Columbus, the time of the crucifixion of Christ, to the time when the mastodon was the eyewitness to the falls at Niagara. Sheer poetry of the yonder callings of time. In the world of yonder, time is duration, the past is present, the future is imagined with hope, and the now is transformed by all of that. What people said when they looked in Lincoln's eyes was that he held a dreamy, longing look. Time is also running out, and this talk will be over in a minute. Yonder is where out there is so beautiful or big that you feel something inside here. And so yonder is the sense by which the inner life of the better angels of our nature is brought into contact with the outer life of the divine will, when necessity becomes providence. What Lincoln did with his language was to connect the inner life of the best of all human nature to the outer circumstances of our history. Such language takes the events of a people's time and says, this is the spirit of that event. That's what he did at Gettysburg. Putting words to that spirit, the words themselves become the culture of the people. Theologians like H. Richard Niebuhr and Paul Tillich tell us these things. The language of a people's culture is their religion. And a prophet, and a poet, or a Lincoln can be the source of that language. Lincoln's words were not that there were angels surrounding the country and giving aid to those who were on God's side. The angels were, and this is his religious poetry at its best, the angels were to be found in the better angels of our nature. There, in our nature, is where the horizon touches heaven. That is the boundary he defined for our history. Lincoln believed in necessity and providence so ardently that he had little faith in human free will. He cast himself upon the waters of life, and to use one of his favorite nouns and verbs, thought of himself as driftwood, and drifted into policies and into actions because of events. And then he enacted those policies, and he did so with strength and astounding authority. Once in the river, he fought mightily to steer the ship and to save it, but in the end, he came to know that the charts for navigation, and Lincoln once had mastered Craddock's navigational charts for the Mississippi, the charts for navigation were not what made the voyage safe or good. The deist God, the clockmaker God of Washington and Jefferson and Franklin, was not able to interpret the suffering and the bloodshed and the horrors of life as Lincoln had come to experience them personally and nationally. And so while he did not feel redeemed himself, he came to feel that we had atoned for our offense of slavery through that terrible swift sword, through the stamping out of the vintage of the grapes of wrath, and through the whirlwind that took us to the beauty of the lilies and the glory of God's bosom, where there is malice for none and charity for all. In the end, Lincoln did for us what the teacher Annie Sullivan did for Helen Keller. He took our hands and he wrote upon them the words we needed to know. In every culture, Paul Tillich has said, even on words on the rocks in the Tillich Garden, there is a transcendent spirit. And there is a language of that spirit in a culture. And the language of that culture's spirit is its religion. And where those 3 points are connected, spirit, language, and culture, then and there people hear their religion. That is what prophets do. That is what Abraham Lincoln did as our secular language president. Lincoln's longtime best friend was Joshua Speed. The historian Kenneth Winkle tells us that Speed, near the end of his long life, long after Lincoln's death, said this: "Watching all those years Lincoln rise was like a fiction, not a fact." He said of his friend Abe, it was like a young eagle. Watching Lincoln rise like a young eagle, stretching his wings to catch the wind that was America, and leaving the world below him to soar to the horizon beyond. None but a genius like his could have accomplished so much, and none but a government like ours could have produced such a man. It gave the young eagle scope for his wing. Animal images, especially birds, are often associated with revelations of the Spirit. The descending dove, like in our sculpture in the roofless church, is what blessed Jesus at his baptism. A young eagle, lifted on his own wings by a unique American wind, has a yonder view of things. Yonder is where vision meets horizon. It is a real place. It is a place for us to look, to seek, to find, lest we become lost.